Hey guys, this video tutorial is going to show you how to install ESTEST software for versions greater than or equal to 0.9.9. As always, the first thing you want to do is to install the ExistDB dependency for ESTEST. And the way we do that is to download the installer for version 1.4.0 of Exist and run the installer using the command java-jar and then the path to the installer jar file. This is going to start up the Exist Interactive Installation GUI. So we go through this installer and filling in the appropriate information. We're going to install exist to this path, and then you can choose your exist administrator password. So we click next and go through the remainder of the installation process. And then once this is done, we want to start up the exist database. So we go to the location where we installed exist, in this case home opt exist, and then execute the command /bin startup.sh. Okay, so now that exist is started, the next step we want to do is to unpack the ESTEST source archives. So there are two source archives for ESTEST. One is going to be followed by a version number, that is the main source tree for ESTEST, and another called third party is going to contain all the third-party libraries that are used with ESTEST. So we want to unpack the main source tree first. The command to that is tar-xf ESTEST version number. And then we're going to change directories into the unpacked directory, and we're going to unpack the third-party library archive directly into this directory. Okay, so now we're ready to install ESTEST, and that's really easy. So we're just going to hit the command make install. And the first thing it's going to ask you is for your username at estest.ucdavis.edu. Well, assuming that you've downloaded the archive for ESTEST and the third-party libraries, you're going to have a username to use for this field. For this tutorial, we're going to just use the admin account. Where appropriate, it's going to ask you to authenticate into the SVN to pull additional sources for ESTEST. And then it's going to launch the interactive ESTEST installer. So fill in the questions here to the best of your ability. We're going to just use some default information for our account. What is the domain name for this server? You can leave this as localhost for this example, but what you really want to fill in is the domain name for your server. It's going to ask you where exist is located, and that was this previous directory we have here. So we can fill that in. It's going to ask you for the port, and the default one is fine. And then it's going to ask you for a directory to store temporary user registration files. Well, this can be any directory on the local file system, but we're going to recommend that you use the one under the under the ESTEST source tree rather. That's www/registration private cache. So just grab the full path to this and fill that in. Make sure that you note that this directory has to be writable by the whatever web server that you're going to choose to run ESTEST from. So that usually involves changing the group permissions of this directory and also the group owner, so that's writable by some kind of Apache daemon, for instance. Okay, so the next step in the installer is going to ask you to authenticate using your exist administrator password. This is the password we chose earlier. And it's going to ask you to reindex the collection. It's just saying yes is okay. And it's going to ask you to whether you want to use an Apache web server, and that is the default one that most people use with ESTEST. So just say yes. And then finally, it's going to ask you again for your exist administrator password in order to initialize the plugins for ESTEST. So just fill that in, and it's going to say that it's updating the plugins that you've pulled. So at this point, it's done for the installation file. There are a couple of things you want to check. You want to check that this file .site packages myconfig.py is properly initialized with the information that you filled in using the interactive installer. And you can just look at that very quickly. and then check that everything is okay. If it looks okay to you, the next thing we want to do is to look at the sample HTTPD include file that we've generated and then include that into your web server configuration. So we've previously installed a version of HTTP here. That's 2.2.15, so we're going to change into that source directory and then edit the configuration file directly. So anywhere at the end, we can just directly import the sample include file for the ESTEST. And we see here we've added a few directives and directories for the web server to serve for the portions of ESTEST. So we save this file and we can start our web server. Using this command. And then go launch your web browser and navigate to the localhost /ESTEST. And we can see that we have a new fresh installation of ESTEST ready to go. You can log in using the admin account, that is the first one, set up using exist, and then look at your settings and perhaps create some simulation files. So at this point you're ready to go with ESTEST. If you have any problems with installing ESTEST, you can go to our website estest.ucdavis.edu or email us at estest.dev@gmail.com. We hope that